Hello and welcome to the Shepheard Walwyn podcast series. My name is Jonathan Brown. Shepheard Walwyn is a campaigning book publisher based in London, England. Our purpose is to uncover and promote new ideas to society's oldest problems. And whilst our specialty is ethical economics, something Anthony Werner, our driving force for over 40 years, has pioneered, we have branched out over the years to other related areas such as the environment and the lives and works of society's change agents. These podcasts promote ideas we're convinced can actually help us build a better society for all of us. So have a listen and be sure to share with your friends if you like them, but also tell us what you think. These are debates we all need to be part of. So without further ado, let's get into the interview. My guest today is Stephanie Peirolo, author of the newly released book The Saint and the Drunk, a guide to making the big decisions in your life. Stephanie is a board-certified executive coach with a BA from Stanford and an MA in Transformational Leadership from Seattle University's School of Theology and Ministry. She's a recovering alcoholic, and she's also an associate of the Sisters of St. Joseph of Peace, an international community of Catholic sisters who work for peace through justice. She's a writer and broadcaster and has a newsletter on Substack, a podcast on leadership, and she provides consulting and trainings for corporate and non-profit organisations. Stephanie, it's lovely to see you again.
It's nice to be back.
So Stephanie, I want to do a slightly different approach today. We've talked about you as an author. We've talked about some of the strands in the book. What I'd like to talk about in this conversation are some of the deeper, the themes that bind the book together. And one of the things that I loved both in our conversation and also the book was the idea that finding a spiritual connection is like cleaning a dirty window to let the sun in. And how the ideas in the book and St. Ignatius and Bill and all of it just helps us to clean our window so we can see more clearly.
So first, I'm trying to reframe the narrative at this idea that finding a spiritual connection or tuning into your own inner wisdom is something that is only for special, magical, spiritual people, or something that needs to be mediated by someone else, or something that is unusual, right? Which is why I like the image of a window. And I'll use this when I do this content in a retreat. I will show a picture of a dirty window, and then I will say the purpose of discernment is to clean this window so the sunlight of the spirit can come in, so that you can have access to the energy, the light, the illumination, whatever language you want to use. It is available to you. It is just obscured, partially or entirely, by things that you can clean away. And for a lot of people, that's a sort of radical reframe. My connection to my intuition, even for people who crave that, my connection to the divine is that accessible. I just have to do a few simple things to clear that away. That in and of itself is a reframe for people. I'm not suggesting that it's always easy, but it is, I believe, available for most of us.
I love the idea that there's a long-term practice in cleaning your window. There's also if not a daily practice, then there's a regular practice of keeping the glass clean and knowing that just through our day-to-day lives, things can get a little bit murky, can't they?
Well, and I think there's almost like kind of two pieces to it, right? There's people for whom this resonates may find themselves in one of two places. Their window may be completely obscured. There may be not a chink of light coming through, and they feel a need for or desire a pretty significant transformation. Then there may be people who are farther along the continuum. The light is a little bit dim and they hadn't really realized it, but some stuff is built up and they need to clean it off. And so recognizing that there can be in our discernment process, sometimes we need large shifts, right? Sometimes the decision we are making it's massive, it's tectonic, it's really significant. And we may need to rethink many aspects of our identity and our personality. Sometimes the decisions that we're making are part of a long process of change and adjustment, and we just need a little bit of fine tuning. And the idea is that discernment tools can work on any one of those situations, wherever you are in that spectrum in terms of the kind of change you need or are called to do.
I was just thinking then about the first time when you go to a recovery meeting, when there's that combination of hitting bottom and not knowing what the hell to do, but knowing that what you've been doing is totally wrong and you can't do it anymore because it may kill you.
Well, and one of the things that really drew me to both Ignatius and Bill Wilson is the idea that these were men who were at a really significant turning point in their life. I'm a recovering alcoholic. I've been sober for 36 years. And the way that I was when I was drinking and the way that I am now or have been as a sober person is very different. And what is appealing to me is that both the spiritual exercises and the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous, which have now been adopted to other recovery programs, they're both a process. Do these things in this order, and you will have a transformation. And that is essentially what we want in a discernment process. Often we want to transform our lives. We want to transfigure the way that we think or move through the world, or we want to fundamentally change our relationship with other people or money or whatever it is. It's usually involving change. And change is often very painful, difficult, and challenging. And so what I love about these two writers is that they said, do these things and the change will happen, right? So in the 12th step of the 12th step process, it says, having had a spiritual experience as the result of these steps, right? So do these things, whether you believe in God or not, whether you think it'll work for you or not, and you can have a spiritual experience. And again, I'm not suggesting that 12 steps are right for everybody. There's lots of different ways to get clean and sober. I'm not in any way advocating it, but to me, the concept, the invitation that you can do some things and you will have a transformation that's so significant. You can go from being a blackout drunk like I was to somebody who doesn't need alcohol no matter what happens in their life. That's pretty significant. And so that's what seems to me to be powerful, is that when we think about a decision-making process as an intellectual pros and cons exercise, it's very small. But the idea that some discernment processes will change your entire life. It'll change completely how you move through the world. The difference between St. Ignatius of Loyola being a mercenary to being a priest and a spiritual guide, that's a really radical change. And so there's something interesting to me in saying this engine, the foundation of this discernment process, is so ancient and so powerful that it has transformed people's lives. It has literally saved them from death. And oh yeah, you can also use it to decide where you want to go to graduate school.
Yeah, fantastic. And if we're thinking about the consequences of allowing the window to get so dirty that you have to put yourself into recovery, right? For the normal day-to-day stuff, what are some of the things that stand out for you through your practice and through your own work and working with others that cause our glass to become so obscured?
I think there's a number of different things that can operate. One is fear, right? We're afraid that we're going to lose something that we have, or we're not going to get something that we think we must have. Fear of financial insecurity, fear of loss, fear of losing a loved one, fear of being alone. Most of us can come up with a list of our own personal fears. And so fear can be a big block. Greed can be also a sense of like, I must have this thing, right? Whatever it may be. And this reliance on, I must have this. If I have this thing, I will be okay. I will be healed. Everything will be okay. And I think that there's also a lot of cultural narratives. I think of our economic system, late stage capitalism, as just throwing mud against the window. Right? There are things that are happening systemically that are challenging us, calling away from our genius as human beings, separating us from community. And religion itself can obscure our connection, right? And what I mean by this, the connection is, it might be your connection to your own inner knowing, or it might be your connection to the numinous, right? Your ancestors, wisdom, God. Some people just want to find God. And the idea that it is as straightforward as cleaning that window can be a real surprise, because we are told that in order to find God, you have to meet this whole checklist of things that you have to do. And there's moral behaviors and certain things you can do and not do. I don't think any of that's true. I think all of us have the capacity and the opportunity to have that connection, but some of us have to clear away more stuff depending on who we are and what we've been taught.
Yeah, I'm just reminded of our first conversation about some of the what I describe as the badass saints that you talk about, a trained killer and having the spiritual awakening through his recovery from injury. Or I think you talked about Teresa as well.
Yeah,
Is that
Saint
right?
Teresa of Avila having a bit of a bad temper.
Yeah, and not needing to be the archetypal good person in order to have a very deep and powerful relationship with something beyond you. I love the idea you just said there about people throwing mud at your window in order to stop you seeing clearly and to stop the light coming through. Again, just doing that work is so important.
Well, and one example of that is sometimes when I will work with this content in a retreat setting, people will show up who have been excluded from Christianity because of their sexual orientation or gender identity. And they want to be welcomed, and they have been unwelcome. They have been kicked out. And that to me is a great example of someone who maybe grew up in a faith tradition, felt a connection to the divine, had a spiritual practice, and then were told their very identity was repugnant, that they were going to burn in hell, or these horrible lies. That is going to obscure your sense of welcome from the divine, right? And the idea of radical hospitality is really interesting to me, because I don't believe that any of us is excluded from the love of God. I believe we are all welcome. We are all invited, and we don't have to do anything special to get there. There's a lot of Christianity that would violently disagree with me.
Mm.
And so some of those ways that people have been separated from the divine is by institutions telling them that God does not love them because of who they are. And that's wrong.
Yeah. And so, how would you help someone understand how you talk about mapping the facts of our lives and identifying our values? How could that help us clean the window?
Well, I mean, one of the blocks to connection is doing something that you know is not right. I'm not a big fan of the idea of sin. Recovery programs use the idea of a defective character, which I also don't like. I prefer the notion of a sort of spiritual chiropractic, that sometimes our instincts get out of whack and we need a little alignment to put them back in place. There's nothing wrong with wanting to have a partner, but that can go into the extreme. There's nothing wrong with wanting to be able to support yourself and live comfortably, but that can go to the extreme. And so I think that there are things that we can do that are not congruent with our values that can take us away from that connection, that can dirty that window. And so I think what's important is to understand what our values are and try to live our lives in a way that is congruent. And I know that the notion, some of these old religious terms like temptation and good and evil are misused and sometimes not useful. But there's an example that I particularly like. So in the spiritual exercises of Ignatius of Loyola, he uses the imagination all the time. And he invites us into these different sort of movies in our mind, if you will. And one of the exercises is called the two standards. And he invites us to imagine two armies, because of course he was a soldier, the army of good and the army of evil. and each one has a flag. That's the standard, is the flag. And you need to pick which one you are part of. You need to pick which flag you're standing under. And while I can acknowledge intellectually that it's binary, it's reductionist, and he uses the idea of Jesus is on one side and the devil is on the other, there's many ways in which that is problematic. Emotionally, it has a deep appeal to me because I think there are many times in our life where we have to choose. And sometimes they seem like small choices, but they actually turn out to be bigger choices. We choose our own comfort rather than a vow or a promise we have made. We put a relationship in jeopardy. We allow something to become addictive behavior that damages other people. There's a lot of ways in which we have to make a moral choice. And I do like the idea of saying, let's not pretend that there aren't moral choices that we make in our life. One of the examples that I use in the book is this notion of there were lawyers who spent and spend much of their days trying to keep the Sacklers, who were the family that owned the pharma company that brought Oxy to the United States and responsible for the deaths of many, many people, a huge social evil that they perpetuated. And there are people whose entire job is to keep the Sacklers from having to pay for that, literally and figuratively. I am guessing that some of those people went to law school and thought that they were going to help the world or to uphold an ideal of justice. But for various reasons, they drifted into supporting a group of people who did something that I would consider to be evil and damaging. And I think that we do ourselves a disservice when we are at a moral fork in the road and we pretend that it's not, that we justify it, that we have a reason to not do that. And so I do think that we need to recognize if we are moving in a direction that is something we don't think is right, it is corrosive to us. And we can't expect to be spiritually connected, grounded, and ultimately whole, right? With that kind of wholeness of spirit, if we are moving in opposition to what we believe is right.
Mm. Yeah, and being clear on what your values are makes it much easier to see that fork, doesn't it?
Yes.
No, great point. Great point. Is there anything more you want to say about the window metaphor or the dark film that obscures our ability to see things?
I think it's like all metaphors and what I say throughout the book. Rest where you find fruit is something that the Jesuits say. If something is useful and helpful and resonant for you, sit with it. If it doesn't speak to you at all, let it go. If the image of the window resonates with someone who's listening, great. If it seems dumb to you and you're like, that doesn't, then that's fine too. Either one of those things are valid. Use this as an opportunity for your own listening.
One of the things that stood out for me in your work was the idea that there's no gate to God. I just wondered if you could take us through what you mean by that.
I live in the United States during the Trump administration, and there are some very strong opinions about what being a Christian means. And I believe some of them are wrong. And part of what I want to do with this book is reclaim spirituality. And maybe for Christians who think like me, reclaim Christianity. And the idea that there is no gate to God is that there doesn't have to be a mediator between you and the divine or between you and your own inner wisdom. So one of the things that was revolutionary about Ignatius is he was a Catholic priest in the Middle Ages, and he obviously talks about Catholicism in all the ways. However, what he said was that you can go directly to God. You don't need a priest. You don't need a church. And that was really revolutionary. Throughout the history of the Catholic Church, the Jesuits have often been suspect because they were renegades, because they believed you could just willy-nilly connect to God. And that was really unusual at the time, to say you can pray and get direct guidance from the divine, because organized religion is really often invested in being the gate to God, right? Like we decide who gets to be holy. We decide who doesn't. You can't just go off and like have a spiritual experience on your own without the approval or disapproval of organized religion, or in some cases, it's not even religion, it's just cultural. And that to me is especially pernicious. And I feel like we need to reclaim that. We all have access to the divine. We all have wisdom that we carry within ourselves. And that the people who are telling us that we don't are maybe
The importance of deciding things for yourself and thinking for yourself about the important decisions. Whatever side of the political debate you're on is just so important. Consider people whose opinions you value, but it comes down to you making your choice. And I think what you just said earlier about there's times when you're facing what looks like a simple decision, but it's actually a moral choice, and it's important that you're connected to however you make those choices.
yes, in that it is empowering to recognize that we can access our own wisdom. But I do worry a little bit about a moral relativism that makes it kind of a false both sides ism. So, for example, anyone who calls themselves a Christian who espouses policies and systems that cause more children to die is suspect to me. Right? So I think one of the things that I believe about having a values oriented operation is that as individuals, we can come to our own decision. But there are things that we should be able to agree on as people who have a spiritual practice. Most people who have a spiritual practice believe in compassion, care for the poor, some sort of shelter for people who are strangers or refugees. These are basic tenets of all organized religion, right? In the Jewish tradition, they talk about tikkun olam, pulling together the broken shards of the world. And I think that it is important for people who are moving through the world with intention to have compassion for everyone as our siblings in divine love, but also be able to name ways in which systems and governments and corporations are behaving in a way that is amoral or immoral. And that is also a part of being spiritual, is to say, I don't believe this is right, and take appropriate actions to protect those who are most vulnerable.
Mm. I just wondered how you see the concept of higher power in AA and other recovery groups as aligning with the ideas of direct access to the divine, regardless of specific religious beliefs.
I like the idea that what is appealing to me about higher power is the notion that you as an individual are invited to figure out what works for you, and that it's really not anybody else's business what that is, right? So the higher power to me is the embodiment of the idea that there's no gate to God, right? There may not even be a God, and that's all good. You can decide what it is for you that works. I think what's also interesting to me about 12-step spirituality is the idea that anyone can have a profound spiritual experience that can change their life. Because I think when you talk about having a spiritual experience, it does seem a little outdated, old black and white movie. Bill Wilson said that he was in the hospital because of his alcohol abuse, and he heard the voice of God. And that's very off-putting to a lot of people. There's a variety of spiritual experiences. Some of them are dramatic, some of them are more subtle, but that they are readily available and practical, right? That the whole point of a 12-step program is that people who are drunks and drug addicts or compulsive gamblers or whatever are like ruining their lives through this compulsive behavior. And they do some things and they have a psychic and spiritual change that is sufficient for them to move through the world without being crippled by that addiction. That just seems really interesting to me. And again, not that there aren't other ways to deal with addiction or other things, but just that idea, that model, that possibility seems really intriguing to me.
Yeah, no, fantastic. In terms of what could stop us building our own relationship, you talk about culture and familiar narratives.
One of the things that I mentioned in a previous podcast, James Finley, who has this podcast called Turning to the Mystics, and he has been doing retreats for decades. And he said that he will go and do a retreat about the mystics, and people who are Christians and Catholics say to him, how come I've never heard of this before? I've been a Catholic my whole life. I go to church every Sunday. I've never heard of the mystic tradition. Why is that? And what he has said is that a lot of those people have a mystical streak. They have a talent for spirituality, as Karen Armstrong says. They are drawn to the mystic tradition, but they didn't know it existed. And so part of what is keeping us from opening that gate is we don't know. It's like, that old house that has a hidden door, and you don't see it until someone pops the door open or says, that's the handle, right? And so I feel like that's part of what I'm trying to do, is to say, you can open it by yourself, right? You can have access to the divine, higher wisdom, whatever it is. And you just have to do some things, change your mind, be open to other experience. C.S. Lewis writes about the fact that he says, I've never been to New York, but I have it on good authority that it exists. And I really like that idea. Like, I feel like part of what I'm trying to do in this book is say, I have been to New York and it is wonderful. Let me show you New York. And a lot of people, they have a longing. They feel dissatisfied with their life, and they feel like they want more meaning or community or connection. They might have tried religion, they might have tried different spiritual practices, but they have this homesickness, a sort of yearning, and they don't know what it is. And for some of those people, what they are yearning for is the divine. What they are yearning for is a connection to the inner wisdom, but they don't even know what that longing is. And so that's really the people that I think this book is for, who have that inchoate sense of something missing, and something about the idea of it being spiritual resonates for them. Those are the people that I think are going to be drawn to this book and get the most from it.
Brilliant. There was another theme that I just wanted to have a look at, and I think you described it in one place as the intellect isn't all that. And I'm drawn immediately to the master and his emissary, and the way in which we've got the intellect. And because this is a book about decision making, it'd be very easy for someone to see it as an intellectual process, but you have the intellect isn't all that, but also the genius of the body, and about bringing in embodied decision making in a very real way to improving someone's decision making, and combining the two together. I just wonder if you could take us through some of those ideas around the intellect not being all that.
And no slight to the intellect, but I think it is a tool that has also been misused. That the dominant culture and people in power have a tendency to tell people without power, this is how reality is, and often it's not accurate. Women particularly have been maligned for being too emotional, thinking with their hearts, not being logical or rational. And so there's been this longtime privileging of the intellectual, the logical, the rational, which leaves out a lot of how we make decisions, a lot of how we are as human beings, right? We know that we make decisions with our emotions. Our emotions give us valuable information all the time. And so I think it's recognizing that the intellect is a useful animal, right? But it shouldn't be completely in control, because then we miss out, right? Because the emotional also leads us into the sense of how we are connected to others. In indigenous decision-making traditions, there is a consciousness of future generations. How will this impact 6 generations forward, 7 generations forward? That is part of the felt sense of being in community, and being in community with the people who came before you and the people who will come after you. we can all see that if we as a culture, as a globe, had been making decisions about our world and how we treat it, being mindful of 6 generations forward, we would be in a very different place. And so it's recognizing that the intellect is one source of knowledge, but there are many sources of wisdom that are not governed by the intellect. And that's for some aspects and some people, particularly from marginalized communities, the insistence on logic and rationale can actually be a way of disempowering us.
Mm. Yeah, I was really quite surprised about the importance that Ignatius plays and that your processes um, pay to imagination. I just wonder if you can take us through some of the ways in which we can use imagination to make better decisions.
Well, and this is the first tool that I ever rolled out. I was talking to a friend of mine at work, and she was deciding whether or not to leave her job and become a professional photographer. And I said, well, how do you make decisions? And she said, I make a pro and con list. And I said, okay, well, let me try something with you. I said, I want you to imagine getting up and going to work at your regular job and deeply imagine it with your senses. What does it feel like to go to work? How do you interact with the people throughout your day? And use all of your senses to deeply immerse yourself in the experience of staying at your current job. And then do, as a meditation practice, the exact same thing, imagining being a photographer every day. And then listen to what you say as you deeply imagine yourself using your senses in both of those alternate options. What does your emotion tell you? Do you feel good? Do you not feel good? And what Ignatius did, this was the cornerstone of his decision-making process. He's lying in bed. His leg is broken. He's had multiple surgeries. He's trying to decide, and he would imagine himself going back to fight as a mercenary, and he would feel really good. He'd feel this uptick of emotion, and he would feel excited and think about being in battle, and then it would quickly taper off. And when he did the same exercise, deeply imagining himself becoming a priest, he felt good, and he stayed feeling good, and he felt grounded and satisfied and fulfilled for a long time. And he kept doing that exercise. And that is one of the fundamental aspects of the spiritual exercise, is imagine yourself in a place and see how it feels to you. Try it on. He invites us to use imagination in a very embodied way. What do you taste? What does it smell like? He invites us to use biblical stories as a source of imagination. Take a biblical story and put yourself in it. What character calls to you? Is it hot? Is there dust on your feet? What are you wearing? Right? And to really use your body as a way of accessing the emotions. And it's funny because people will often, I explain the concept, they're like, yeah, 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 yeah. And then I'll take them in retreat through a guided meditation, and they will often be surprised by what comes up for them, that really strong emotional reactions or deep insights can come through doing this simple practice of imagine option one, imagine option B, and get curious and open-minded about it. And they get a lot of information.
You talk about intuition and spirit and the intuitive thought, and in another video, we talked about attraction and aversion, which was one of the key things with that, just listening and noticing the little feelings that can be there. It resonates very deeply. I've done a lot of work on intuitive decision making in turbulent situations, often dangerous situations. Very similar a process to noticing those feelings and honoring a feeling over a thought in those situations. If you feel unsafe, get out of a situation immediately. There's a guy called Gavin De Becker who was the inspiration for the film Bodyguard, the Kevin Costner figure of celebrity security. But he wrote a book called The Gift of Fear, which was entirely consistent with your approach about aversion and noticing those feelings and honoring them. And even if they don't make sense, honoring the feeling and responding to it.
And realizing that you might be right? That we can have access. The part about the intuitive thought is the chapter in the book talks about the fact that discernment can be a process of small insights and a practice, and it can be slow and not dramatic and kind of take some time, but occasionally you get a dramatic insight.
Yeah.
And it doesn't happen a lot, but there have been times where I have all of a sudden just knowing what to do, where before 15 minutes before I was completely confused, and something happens internally where something falls into place and I have a deep sense of conviction as to what my decision should be. And so I wanted to put that out there, that you can have an intuitive thought. For me, sometimes it feels like it comes from the divine. For other people, it may be their expertise, their instincts, something that their brain senses that they don't. Whatever it is, you can have that dramatic revelation. And that can be great, because then it's like, oh, okay, clearly this is my burning bush moment, and now I know what to do.
Yeah. I mean, it's like with intuition, there's a whole thing that people seeing it as pattern recognition. Basically, you're just seeing everything that's in your environment, and you're able to make sense of all these variables. Some of them are unconscious, but the situations when you talk to these people who've been in very difficult situations, is there's times when information appears to them where it's not possible that you can have a local interaction with it. And so something non-local comes into the situation. And I know I've spoken with soldiers who had an intuition that they had to get to their friend and save their life because they were in all kinds of trouble. And it was like, well, how did you explain that? I can't explain it. I just knew my brother was in trouble and I had to go help him. And they honored that connection. And I think that's one of the wonderful thing that you've got with the inner sense, but also being open to something bigger, is that we can become open to relationships that are not apparent and not immediately apparent, and they could be extraordinarily powerful ones. And it could be with the spiritual, but it could also be your relationship with another, and hearing someone's cry from a distance that your ears can't hear, but your heart can. And I think when you talk about the genius of the body is what's possible with that when you take it to a deeper level, right?
Yep. And honoring our connection to others too, that we are attached to one another. We learn things from one another, and that it's privileging that as well. We are relational beings, and that there's a wisdom in that relationship as well.
Yes, absolutely right. And you're talking that you don't beat people over the head with it, but you've certainly had your challenges in life, and that's whether it's in the first video you were talking about having to run a radio show with two kids knocking on the glass, and some of the realities of working in corporate America and the corporate world. And so here's some of the things you can do. I'm just wondering if someone was leading an organization, just acknowledging that sometimes it's very difficult and nasty choices in business and in organizations. How could we apply the principles that you talk about in the book to improve our collective and our group decision making?
I think that organizations that can empower individuals, agree on a moral or ethical framework, right, can actually do a process similar to this as an organization. And it would be great to see that. I certainly know of nonprofit organizations that try to do that agree, because the whole point of discernment is for an individual to figure out what their work in the world is, right? Like, what are they called to do in the world? Organizations can certainly try to understand and discern what work they are to do in the world, and then use tools to empower people to use their own individual wisdom to move that forward. I think that it's very, in my experience in corporate America, which is in the United States, primarily with advertising and technology companies, it's very challenging to do that in a for-profit environment, because all of the systems are set up to undercut most of the principles that are happening in this book, right? There's a lot of systemic challenges. So I think that if an individual or a group wanted to look at some of this, I think they would have to be clear about what is realistic for them to do within the system. And then I think the leaders would have to have some discernment about which flag they were flying under and whose side they were on. I think you cannot have a for-profit, short-term shareholder gain mentality and expect to support the people that work for you as human beings and effective workers. Organizations that do have a moral framework are certainly, at least where I live, having a resurgence. Being intentional about decisions is positive, but I think it's very challenging to do in this corporate environment.
Yeah, I mean, if we think about the implications of what you've just said, then it's actually quietly terrifying because this is a book about making better decisions and decisions that will last the test of time, right? You talked earlier about in an indigenous community asking about sixth or seventh generation rightness of a choice. You know, how will this play out in 6 or 7 generations? And one of the world's richest men and one of the best business investors talks about asking everybody who comes into his company, say, I want you to imagine that you've only got one company that has to provide for you and your family and all your grandchildren. Please run your company in that way. And it's this, there's no problem with any company adopting this approach. I'd say you're going to be more profitable. The issue is short term shareholder return. This will be long term value creation, transformation. If you're looking at it as a shareholder, you're looking at a 5 to 10 year payout, then this is working. If you're looking at the next 3 months, then and you want to just control stuff and you want more money to go to you rather than to everybody, then we've got a serious problem. I can see it working for owner operated businesses, what we describe in the UK as SME, small and medium sized enterprises, especially
Right.
ones where the founder led. You've got to have people making good choices in the field, and that means you have to have discerning people running your businesses.
And I have certainly worked with clients who were very intentional about what their work was in the world. And they have very successful businesses that are very profitable and that are run ethically and intentionally. Sometimes we can make decisions with the best of our ability, with a thorough, deep discernment process, and it doesn't work out the way that we want. And what I have found is that we make decisions with the information that's available to us at the time, and sometimes circumstances change. So having a discernment process and doing a thorough discernment process doesn't mean you could do a discernment process to take a certain job and you could get fired. Circumstances change. And so it's not that you are protected from things going wrong later. But what I have found is that I am insulated from regret because I can stop and say, I was intentional about this decision. I used all of the tools available to me at the time. I honored it. I took my time with it. I gave it space. I got advice from trusted elders. I did the best I could. And I have confidence in that decision. And I'm much less likely to regret a discernment process, even if it doesn't turn out the way that I hoped, because I know I can go back and do another discernment process and I can continue to use it. So I think of discernment as a spiritual practice, right? Like I meditate every morning. Sometimes I have good days, sometimes I have bad days. I still meditate. It's not the fault of my meditation. I have a spiritual practice of meditation, and some days I have a good day, and some days I have a bad day. I keep getting better the more I meditate. And it's the same thing with discernment.
When I think about the companies that I'm working with, then the importance, going back to our first conversation around some of the deeper patterns or webs of ideas in this book, is the whole idea about keeping the window clean and letting the light in. And for me, the detachment that so many more and more people, political as well as business leaders, have of being detached from reality, which as you go into turbulent situations is the single most dangerous thing to address, and the most dangerous thing to worry about is to what extent are you actually seeing clearly.
Just want to call out the fact that an individual, particularly a leader, but any individual can impact a system. And if there were someone who was in a position of authority at a company who read this book and who incorporated some of these principles and tried to honor in themselves and in other people our own individual wisdom, decision-making process that was curious and embodied. Some of these principles, I think it would make a significant difference. And I'm sure you've seen this working with leaders as I have as an executive coach. You get a leader who transforms, who becomes more intentional, more self-aware, more committed to doing what they think is right. The entire organization shifts in a positive way.
Yeah.
And it really is important. So I think anyone can change their family system, their work environment, even their community by their own individual evolution and growth.
I totally agree. People who would really appreciate this decision making, that would really resonate with, is military. Military and violence professionals, which may contradict your values. But what I'm talking about is being physically embodied. It's not just about being a jock, but it's being in a state of being very much like Ignatius, a righteous warrior, doing the right thing and living to a code of ethics and a principle. But so let's just move on from the corporation. The other thing that I absolutely love about work is honoring resistance in terms of noticing what resistance we have in our lives and how we can honor it and change our relationships to it to get to better choices.
The point of honoring resistance is to accept as valuable where you don't want to do something, right? Not push through it, but actually get curious about why you don't want to do something. I think the challenge in the corporate world, in my experience, is that resistance often impedes success in the corporate environment, right? So I think that the difficulty is to balance the tension between those two things. So, for example, there are many things that happen in corporate America that are challenging, right? I've seen and experienced lots of sexism. I have seen a lot of really unskillful behavior around racism, gender. I mean, most of us have seen all sorts of things, right? And so the idea is, what do you do when you are faced with those situations? Ideally, you can call out and help and support people who don't. But oftentimes you have to put up with things that are difficult. And so that's where I think the tension is, recognizing there were jobs that I worked where I had to work 60 hours a week. I would often work overnight. It was not great for me physically. It was challenging for me as a single mom. But I intentionally stayed at that job because I had very real financial responsibilities. And those jobs also had a certain amount of flexibility. So if I needed to run and go to a sports match for my kids, I could leave the office and then go back to work. So I do feel we often have to make decisions about something that is difficult or undesirable in this season at this moment, and put up with it for a kind of longer term gain. I don't work that way anymore, right? I don't have to do those things. So I do think that resistance is something I talk a lot about in the book, because I think it requires an awareness of a lot of subtle gradients of what is something you just have to buck up, Barbie, and do the thing, even though you dislike it, and try to figure out a way to not have to do that job or that particular thing. And what is really a firm line in the sand that you won't do. And I do think we need to develop the muscles to have that awareness. And that's why being grounded in values, being grounded in intention when you're not in the moment, right? It's kind of like having a little checklist, like these are the things I will and won't do. And I know that in advance. So when somebody says to me, I want you to do this thing, you already know the answer. You don't have to think about it. It removes that sort of decision fatigue or paralysis because you already know the answer to it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that when you talk about the genius of the body and noticing any resistance or things you can feel, then the early you can catch that little nagging sense about this situation that I am uncomfortable with, when everything looks great, but there's something here that is not. And that comes to the surface a whole lot sooner before it gets very troublesome and difficult to deal with, right? Because it could start out with one question to a person who's made a comment that isn't entirely wrong, you as a leader saying to someone, can you clarify what you meant there, or what was your intention by that? Because there's something about what you said that I feel uncomfortable with.
But it's also doing it even if you have no power, you can do that.
Yeah.
Right. So I have been early in my career, I was in positions where I was being actively sexually harassed. And if I had said to myself, I invited this because of how I dressed, what I look like, it was my fault, that is a damaging narrative. But for me to, even in my own brain, say to myself, what he just did was wrong.
Yeah.
And I am going to get out of this job as soon as I can. And I'm going to try to figure out a way to not be treated like this again. There's power in that. And I think what happens so often is when we are treated badly, we, particularly women, will tend to say, maybe it was my fault. He really does mean the best for me. He is trying to help me be better. Whatever, we'll come up with a narrative. And even if you have no power, if you can name in your head, this is wrong, I don't want this, and I am going to take steps to get the heck out of here, that is empowering and that is valuable. And you need to have that clear channel to be able to accurately name and assess, no, this is wrong.
Yeah. I think it's having, you're talking in one of our earlier conversations about the importance of having the compass when the weather's bad. And that came to mind just then, about knowing not just your own value, but also your own moral compass and what you feel is right and wrong. So far, some of the big themes that I was thinking about in your book, are there any others that we could talk about before we wrap up?
I think we're good.
So just to, I hope people have seen this, like some of the deeper stuff that's in the book, but also the very practical application to it. If people have listened to all the podcasts, then they know what I'm going to say next, but just great book, Stephanie, and keep up the great work. And I look forward to our next conversation.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Woo!
Thank you. You are wonderful to talk to. I really appreciated that.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you for listening to the Shepheard Walwyn podcast. To explore these ideas further, be sure to visit our website, www.shepherdwalwyn.com, and join our mailing list for news and special offers. Check out our authors and buy the books to learn more. And you can also find us on social media. Links are also on the website. And if you like the podcast, please head over to iTunes or Spotify to give us a review. It's surprisingly helpful in getting the ideas out there. So until next time, keep reading